What if the ground beneath our feet is not a calendar, but a diary, one that keeps its secrets in layers? In the quiet places of the world, where mines breathe dust and quarries echo with steel, people sometimes find something that doesn't belong. Not the kind of doesn't belong that gets you a new museum wing, but the kind that makes you pause, look again, and feel a small chill of uncertainty. A shape inside stone, a pattern inside coal, an object with straight edges and human intention sealed where time says it should never be. Most of us grow up with a timeline so familiar it feels like instinct. Life begins simple, becomes complex, tools begin crude, become refined. We move from darkness to firelight, from rough stone to metal, from gears to silicon. It's not just a story of progress, it's a story that reassures us. It tells us we know where we came from and therefore we know where we are. But every so often, a story arrives from a basement in the Midwest, a hillside in Texas, a crater in Australia, or a volcanic plain in East Africa. Stories collected in the margins of geology and archaeology, where curiosity survives even when certainty feels safer. Picture a child in 1944, alone in a basement, watching a lump of coal split open like a black seed. Inside, a small bell drops into his hands, not a fossil, not a crystal. A bell, metal shaped by design, made to ring. The coal came from a seam dated to an era when dense forests were turning into the planet's deep fuel long before humans, long before mammals, long before anything that could have dreamed of casting metal. And yet, the bell is there, sealed like a message slipped into an envelope of stone. Or picture a couple hiking in Texas in 1936, noticing a rock with a bit of wood protruding. They break it open and find a hammer, iron head, wooden handle, caught inside a limestone shell that suggests an age not measured in centuries but in tens of millions of years. The wood shows hints of petrification, the metal has an odd purity, and the mind, trained to trust time, instinctively reaches for explanations, contamination, accident, misunderstanding. Maybe. But the story lingers. These accounts don't arrive with orchestras or flashing headlines. They arrive quietly, carried by witnesses, old reports, photographs, museum notes, a handful of researchers who look at the same evidence and refuse to laugh too quickly. Some artifacts vanish into private collections. Some are lost in wars, moves, and estate sales. Some sit behind glass, in small institutions, half legend, half object. And some remain only as written testimony, enough to raise a question, not enough to settle one. This is where the mystery begins, and where we need to slow down. Because the ground does speak. Stratification, the arrangement of layers, forms the backbone of how we read Earth's history. Deeper layers generally formed earlier, shallower layers later. Coal takes time. Limestone takes time. Volcanic ash can be dated. Fossils can anchor eras. The methods are not perfect, but they are not trivial either. They are the closest thing we have to a long memory written in rock. So when a manufactured object appears to be sealed inside a layer that should predate human hands, it doesn't automatically mean the timeline is wrong. It could mean the context was misread. It could mean a rock formed around an object quickly. It could mean a hoax. It could mean a chain of custody broke somewhere between discovery and documentation. Human error is as old as humans, and yet a different possibility hovers at the edge of the light. What if our confidence in the story of steady progress is, at least sometimes, more fragile than we admit? What if the record of human presence, like memory itself, has gaps, distortions, and losses? What if the Earth keeps better secrets than our institutions are willing to hold? In this documentary, we'll walk through a series of puzzling reports, objects and traces found where they shouldn't be if the simplest version of the timeline is complete. We won't treat them as proof of hidden empires or absolute truths. We'll treat them as invitations to look carefully, to ask what we know and how we know it, and to consider the uncomfortable space between evidence and interpretation. Because the deeper question isn't whether any one artifact rewrites history. The deeper question is this: when the past doesn't fit the story we prefer, do we change the story or do we stop listening? And if we stop listening, what else might we be missing beneath our feet? It starts the way so many unsettling stories start, not with a revelation, but with someone doing ordinary work. A miner lowers into the earth, expecting the familiar: darkness, pressure, the slow choreography of extraction. A quarry worker splits stone the way you split firewood. Routine, practiced, almost meditative. A construction crew drills through sediment to lay a foundation, thinking only of schedules and concrete. No one goes underground looking for mysteries. Mysteries find them. Imagine the moment a saw blade catches on something that is not rock, a sudden change in pitch, a vibration that travels through the wrists, the instinctive pause, and then an edge, a curve, a surface too smooth, too symmetrical, too intentional. In the language of geology, context is everything. Objects do not matter alone. They matter where they are found. That's why these accounts always return to the same detail. The artifact was sealed, encased, embedded, not simply lying on the ground where it could have been dropped, but trapped inside a material that, according to the slow arithmetic of the planet, should have formed long before humans were capable of making anything at all. Coal, for instance, is not just black rock. It is the compressed ghost of ancient forests, piled and pressed over immense time. It forms in layered seams that speak of vanished swamps, buried under sediments, transformed by heat and pressure. When someone says an object came from inside a lump of coal, they are claiming more than an odd coincidence. They are claiming an intrusion into deep time. Stone can carry a similar weight. Limestone, especially, forms as oceans rise and fall, as shells and sediments settle and harden. In certain cases, it can form around objects more quickly than we assume. Mineral-rich water can cement debris into rock in surprisingly short periods. This matters because it offers a doorway back to the comfort of explanation. Perhaps the ancient stone isn't ancient at all. Perhaps it's a younger crust, a natural casing formed in recent time. Perhaps the artifact is ordinary and only the shell is misleading. But that, too, is part of the tension. The moment a discovery appears, the mind becomes a courtroom. Evidence takes the stand. Doubt cross-examines. And in the background, an invisible jury waits, made up of institutions, reputations, and the quiet fear of being wrong in public. Because the truth is, science is not a simple machine that converts anomalies into breakthroughs. Science is a human practice with human incentives. It moves carefully because care is often the difference between insight and self-deception. But that same caution can turn into a reflex. If something doesn't fit, it must be dismissed. Sometimes that reflex is justified. Hoaxes exist. Misidentifications happen. Ancient objects can be dropped into cracks and later cemented by minerals. Mining operations can mix material from different layers. Collectors can embellish stories. A sensational tale can take on a life of its own. repeating in books and websites long after the original evidence is lost. And yet, dismissal has its own risks. In the history of discovery, the world has a habit of arriving early, showing up before the textbooks are ready. Fossils were once explained as tricks of nature. Meteorites were dismissed as superstition because stones didn't fall from the sky until they did. Deep-sea life was considered impossible until nets came up writhing with creatures no one expected. Time and again, the boundary between impossible and undeniable has been defined not by logic alone, but by what we've already seen. So how do we hold an anomaly responsibly? The first step is to separate the emotional charge from the claim. A strange object does not automatically mean the past is false, but it does mean someone saw something worth recording, and that alone has value. It is data, imperfect, messy, human. The second step is to treat the story like a trail. Who found it? When? In what setting? What was the material? How was it removed? Was it examined? By whom? What was preserved? What was lost? The details are not decoration. They are the difference between an anecdote and an investigation. And the third step is to accept a harder truth. Many of these cases will remain unresolved, not because the universe is conspiring to hide them, but because evidence decays, objects disappear, witnesses die, paper burns, curiosity fades. What we are left with, often, is a question suspended between layers. If the Earth is a diary, then these anomalies are smudged sentences, half legible, half erased. We can't pretend they say what we want, but we also shouldn't pretend they say nothing at all. So tonight, as we step deeper into these accounts, keep one idea close. The mystery is not only in the objects, the mystery is in us. How quickly we decide what the past is allowed to be. The boy was alone when it happened. In 1944, in the middle of a world war, a young teenager in Illinois carried a lump of coal into his family's basement. Coal was ordinary then. Heat, comfort, routine. It came in hard, dusty pieces that left black traces on hands and clothes. You didn't stare at coal and wonder about time. You shoveled it, burned it, moved on. But this boy, by all accounts, liked to tinker. He was the kind who might split a rock just to see what was inside. The basement smelled of earth and winter. The coal sat in his hands like a compressed night. And when he struck it, the seam opened. Something fell out. A small metal bell, shaped with intention, not accident. A loop at the top. A skirt flaring gently at the bottom. It wasn't a fossil. It wasn't a mineral formation pretending to be something else. It looked like what it was, an object designed to ring. If you've never held a bell, it's hard to explain its quiet authority. A bell is a tool, yes, but also a symbol. It calls, it warns, it gathers people from scattered places. It marks time. Churches use bells to speak to the sky. Schools use bells to divide the day. Farms use bells to keep track of animals in tall grass. A bell is a sound you can hold in your hand. And in that basement, the boy held one that supposedly came from inside coal. Coal, as we understand it, is ancient in a way that makes the human story feel brief. It forms from dense plant matter buried under sediments, transformed over huge spans of time and pressure. The seams that feed industry are often tied to eras so old they swallow our intuitions. Hundreds of millions of years, long before humans, long before recognizable mammals, long before the earliest flicker of what we call civilization. That is what makes this story so unsettling. Not because it proves something, but because it invites a collision between two kinds of time, the time of human hands and the time of stone. Accounts describe the bell as ornate, small enough to fit in a palm, with markings that suggested craftsmanship. The coal itself was said to be unbroken until the moment it was split, implying the bell had been sealed within. In some versions of the story, the bell was later examined or displayed. In others, it became a quiet relic that circulated among collectors of anomalies, a physical question mark passed from one set of hands to another. And here we meet the central problem of these cases, the difference between a story and a record. A story can be vivid and sincere and still be incomplete. Coal can crack and re-cement in subtle ways. Objects can become lodged in seams through fractures. Industrial mining can mix material from different depths. A bell could have fallen into coal storage and later seemed to emerge from within when a lump was split. Even honest witnesses can be fooled by the theater of coincidence. But coincidence has its own gravity, because the boy didn't find a nail or a random piece of scrap, things you might easily imagine falling into a coal bin. He found a bell, an object that seems too particular, too deliberate, too strange to be ignored. And whether it truly came from inside ancient coal or not, the story persists because it produces a feeling we rarely admit, that the world might be older, stranger, and less tidy than the narratives we tell. There is a temptation, when faced with such a tale, to jump straight to extremes. Either it's a hoax and nothing more, or it's evidence of lost civilizations, time travelers, or histories rewritten. Both impulses share the same flaw. They rush past the fragile middle where responsible curiosity lives. That middle place asks different questions. What was the coal's source? What seam? What mine? What geological formation? Was the bell photographed, catalogued, tested for composition? Were there contemporaneous reports or only later retellings? Where is the bell now? If it still exists, could it be examined with modern tools, metallurgy, isotopes, surface analysis, to learn not its supposed age in stone, but its manufacturing origin in human time? Because a bell has a fingerprint. Its alloy can reveal industrial methods. Its markings can hint at cultural style. Its wear can suggest use. Even if it was later swallowed by a crack in coal, it might still tell a story, just not the story we first imagine. And then there is the quieter question beneath all of this: why do stories like this matter? They matter because they challenge the relationship between memory and evidence. The past, for most of us, is not something we hold. It's something we believe. We inherit timelines the way we inherit family legends. We trust the experts, the institutions, the textbooks, because we should. But when an object appears to contradict the timeline, we learn something about ourselves. How quickly we defend the story that makes the world feel stable. Maybe the Illinois bell is a misunderstanding. Maybe it's a relic of an ordinary life, misremembered and mythologized. Or maybe it's something else. An example of how the earth can hide and later reveal objects in ways that confuse us. Either way, the bell rings, not in sound, perhaps, but in meaning. It rings as a reminder that the boundary between certainty and mystery is thinner than we think. And it leaves us with an unsettling thought as the basement light flickers over black dust. If an object can seem to arrive from deep time, what else might be waiting inside the ordinary, inside coal, inside stone, inside the layers we walk across without looking down? On a hot day in Texas in 1936, two people walked across land that looked timeless. There is a particular stillness to open country, flat horizons, wind moving through grass, the sun pressing everything into sharp relief. In that kind of landscape, time feels simple. You see old rocks, old trees, old soil. You assume the past is under your feet, in clean layers, like pages stacked in order. Then, according to the account, a rock caught their attention. It was not remarkable at first, just a stone with an odd protrusion, a hint of wood, a shape that didn't match the surrounding debris. Curiosity is a small force, but it can change the story of a day. They picked it up, examined it, and decided to break it open. Inside was a hammer, not a crude chunk of iron, not a vague metallic smear, but a recognizable tool, an iron head with a wooden handle. The head looked worn, as if it had been used. The handle, partly mineralized, carried the texture of wood, preserved in time. The object became known later as the London Hammer, named for the area near London, Texas, an artifact that, in retellings, seemed to arrive from a layer of rock far older than human craftsmanship should allow. This is where the mind begins to split, the way stone splits. One half says, impossible. Tools like that belong to the last few centuries, not the deep geological record. The other half says, but there it is, an ordinary object wrapped in an extraordinary context. The details matter. Limestone can form slowly in ancient seas, yes, but it can also form faster than most people realize, especially when mineral-rich water flows through a region, coating and cementing materials into a stone-like shell. This creates a plausible path back to normalcy. Perhaps the hammer was lost in the 1800s or early 1900s, later encased by a natural concretion, and then mistaken for something far older. The rock's age would not necessarily match the age of the object inside it. That explanation may be correct. It might be the simplest and most responsible interpretation. But simplicity doesn't erase the question. It just changes it. Because even if the casing formed recently, the hammer still becomes a lesson in how easily context can deceive. Our sense of time depends on layers behaving the way we expect them to behave. We treat stone like a locked safe. But nature is not always a careful archivist. Water moves, minerals migrate, cracks open and close. A surface can look ancient and be newly formed. A newly formed shell can look ancient and be mistaken for bedrock. In other words, the past can be forged by processes that mimic age. And then there's the hammer itself. A hammer is not just a tool, it's a gesture. It's the human decision to shape the world by impact. Every civilization that has built anything, homes, ships, railroads, factories, has relied on the simple confidence of a hammer swing. To find one embedded in stone is to see human intention caught inside the planet's slow machinery like a sentence trapped in a glacier. People who have examined the hammer over the years have described the metal as unusually pure, the handle partly petrified, the casing rock hard and convincing. Others have pointed out how similar it looks to 19th century hammers, the kind used by settlers and tradesmen across America. If the hammer is old only by a century or two, it becomes less a portal to ancient worlds and more a reminder that time can create illusions quickly. But if any part of its story holds deeper truth, if the context truly resists the recent concretion explanation, then the implications widen, not into sensational fantasies, but into humbler possibilities, that the archaeological record is incomplete, that objects can be displaced, that the boundaries we draw between eras are sometimes fuzzier than the diagrams suggest. Here is the human tension at the heart of these cases. We want the past, to be orderly. We want neat layers, clean categories, a timeline that behaves like a well-edited documentary. But reality is not edited. It is messy, interrupted, eroded, rearranged. The Earth is constantly rewriting its own pages, so the London Hammer stands at a crossroads between two truths. One truth says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and a strange casing is not enough to overturn a timeline. The other truth says, our confidence is only as good as our willingness to investigate anomalies without mocking them into silence. Perhaps the hammer is a misread artifact. Perhaps it's exactly what it seems. A lost tool, later wrapped in stone, later turned into legend. But even that would not make the story worthless, because it would still reveal something hauntingly familiar. How quickly the world can create the appearance of deep time, and how easily our minds can confuse a shell for a history. And it leaves an open question, hanging in the heat above the Texas grass. If nature can encase a modern object in something that looks ancient, how many other certainties are we building on appearances we haven't truly tested? Long before anyone argued about timelines on paper, the sea was already keeping secrets. In the early 1900s, pearl divers off the coast of Australia worked in a world of breath and pressure. They dropped into green-blue silence with heavy gear, guided by rope and instinct. Down there, everything feels older than language. Sand drifts over shell beds. Currents move like unseen hands. You surface with your lungs burning, and whatever you bring up feels like a message from another realm. According to one enduring account, a diver surfaced holding something that didn't belong among oysters and coral. It looked like a coin, or rather, something coin-like, flat, metallic, stamped with symbols. Not a modern token, not the kind of debris you'd expect from a shipwreck in recent decades, but something that suggested age and origin. The story grew. A handful of such objects, found in places where no one expected them, far from the cultures that supposedly minted them. Coins are deceptively simple. They fit in a pocket. They pass from hand to hand. But they also carry a kind of authority. A coin is a statement by a society. We exist, we trade, we mark value. We trust this symbol enough to build our lives around it. To find a coin in a place where the accepted narrative says it cannot be is to feel the outline of a hidden map. Here, the mystery shifts from the earth to the ocean, because the sea is not a museum. It is a blender. It moves objects across continents and centuries. It erases shipwrecks and then spits fragments back onto shore. It can bury a vessel in sand for decades, then expose it after a storm. It can carry cargo farther than any human intention. That alone offers a sober explanation. Coins travel. Sailors drop them. Wrecks scatter them. Currents relocate them. A diver might find an object miles from its origin, and that origin might be far more recent than the romance of the story suggests. But the ocean has another property that complicates everything. It swallows evidence. If a coin is found inland, you can trace the soil, the layers, the nearby structures. If a coin is found underwater, the context is often gone the moment it reaches the surface. Sand falls away. The exact location blurs. The depth is remembered, not recorded. And in that blur, legend blooms. Yet even if every underwater ancient coin turns out to be an ordinary artifact of trade and ship routes, the deeper question remains, because it points to something we rarely consider. The world has always been connected more than we imagine. Trade networks existed long before global maps were neat and standardized. People crossed seas in fragile vessels, guided by stars and coastline. They drifted off course. They landed where they didn't plan. Some never returned to tell their stories. Most of what happened on the water never became a paragraph in a textbook, because textbooks are written from what survives. So the idea of a coin turning up in an unexpected place, Australia, North America, remote islands, does not automatically mean a shattered timeline. It could mean something quieter, that the past was more adventurous, more accidental, and more human than our simplified narratives allow. And there is another possibility still, one that doesn't require lost super-civilizations or impossible technologies. It requires only time and loss. Imagine a small ship blown off course centuries ago, drifting into unfamiliar waters. The sailors carry coins from home, perhaps as wages, perhaps as luck. A storm breaks the hull. The sea takes them. The coins scatter into sand. 100 years later, a diver finds one and feels the strange sensation of touching a life that never made it into history. That sensation is the emotional core behind these stories. Not the thrill of overturning science, but the ache of realizing how much of human movement, struggle, and improvisation has been swallowed by time. Because a coin is not only metal, it is a hand that held it. A transaction, a gamble, a farewell. It is a pocket emptied onto a dock before a voyage. It is the weight of home carried across water. When we hear a claim that coins appear where they shouldn't, we can respond responsibly without flattening the wonder. We can say, show the evidence, show the provenance, show the analysis, but we can also allow room for a larger truth. The map of human history is drawn from what is found, not from everything that happened. And if the sea has taught us anything, it is this: what is not found does not mean it never existed. So as we move forward, keep listening for that undertow. These anomalies may not be keys to a reversed evolution, but they are keys to something else. Our persistent desire to locate ourselves in time, and our uneasy awareness that time keeps more than one kind of secret. If the ocean keeps secrets by motion, stone keeps secrets by stillness. There is a kind of silence in certain quarries, an industrial silence punctuated by machines, but beneath that, a deeper quiet. Stone walls rise like frozen waves. Dust hangs in the air. Every strike, every cut is an interruption of time. And sometimes, in that interruption, something appears that feels like it's been waiting. One of the most persistent categories of out-of-place stories involves objects found inside rock that seems far older than any human artifact should be. Not just one oddity, but a pattern of claims. Spheres with grooves, metallic shapes, impressions that look engineered, fossils that sit beside things that resemble manufactured parts. And this is where the subject becomes less about any single artifact and more about how we interpret patterns. Because the human brain is a meaning-making instrument. Give it a cloud, and it finds a face. Give it a cluster of lines, and it finds a symbol. In stone, this tendency becomes amplified. Nature produces symmetry. Minerals crystallize into clean angles. Erosion carves shapes that resemble tools. Concretions form spheres, discs, and tubes with uncanny regularity. A person can pull a perfectly round stone from a seam and feel instantly that it must have been made. Sometimes it was, often it wasn't. In South Africa, for example, stories have circulated about small spherical objects found in ancient deposits, some with grooves around their circumference, some appearing unusually uniform. Photographs of them can look startling. They seem almost manufactured, like bearings, or carved stone balls. the imagination jumps. Who made them? When? Why are they in rock that's unimaginably old? But geology has its own repertoire of illusions. Concretions, hard masses formed by mineral cement, can grow around a nucleus in sediment and produce spheres. Grooves can arise from differential weathering, pressure, or the way layers compact. What appears machined might be a record of natural forces repeating with mechanical consistency. This does not make the objects uninteresting. It makes them instructive. Because the real story isn't only whether an artifact is genuine, it's how quickly certainty forms in the mind when a shape looks familiar. We are not neutral observers. We carry a catalogue of expectations. What counts as natural? What counts as made? The boundary is blurrier than we admit. Now consider the other side of the tension. Sometimes things really are manufactured, and the only mystery is how they arrived where they were found. Rocks can move, not quickly in human terms, but relentlessly. Landslides carry debris downhill. Rivers transport objects far from their origin. Glacial action can relocate boulders across landscapes and deposit them like punctuation marks in places they never formed. Mining can bring deep material to the surface and mix it with more recent layers. Cracks and fissures can act as elevators, allowing objects to drop down and later become cemented in mineral deposits that look ancient to an untrained eye. So when an object appears sealed in stone, the most responsible question is not, what does it prove? But, what is the simplest pathway that could have placed it there? Yet simplicity is not always satisfying, because it doesn't erase the feeling these stories produce, the feeling that the Earth has been hiding something. That feeling is worth honoring, not because it confirms the extraordinary, but because it tells us something about human nature. We are creatures who live in time, but cannot touch it. We can measure it, model it, argue about it, but we can't hold it the way we hold a stone. So when a stone seems to hold something that belongs to our world, an impression, a shape, a metallic hint, we feel an electric jolt, the sense that the past might be closer than we think, folded into the present like a letter inside an old book. The danger is what we do next. If we treat every surprising shape as proof of a hidden narrative, we become easy to mislead by coincidence, by error, by hoax, by our own hunger for wonder. But if we treat every anomaly as automatically worthless, we become something else, incurious, defensive, afraid of our own uncertainty. The healthiest place is the narrow ridge between those extremes. On that ridge, we can say, nature can mimic design, and design can be displaced by nature. Both are true. The question is, which is true in each case, and whether the evidence is strong enough to support the claim. And that brings us to a quiet, uncomfortable fact. Many of the most famous impossible objects are famous not because they were studied deeply, but because they were never studied deeply enough. Their stories spread faster than their documentation. Their photographs outlive their provenance. Their conclusions arrive before their measurements. In the next chapter, we'll move from the ambiguous language of shapes to something more intimate, impressions. What look like footprints or tracks, marks that feel undeniably biological, undeniably human, and yet appear in layers that seem too old to accommodate them. Because a footprint is not just an object, it is a moment of presence. It is the past stepping into the present. And if that step is real, then the question becomes less about rocks and more about us. How do we react when the evidence looks like a person walking where no person should be? A footprint is a confession. Unlike a tool which can be moved, traded, lost, or planted, A footprint begins as a brief act of gravity. A body passes through a moment. Weight presses into softness. The ground receives it like wet clay, receiving a thumbprint. Then time closes the door. Sediment covers it, minerals harden it, and the impression becomes stone. When someone claims to have found a human footprint in rock that predates humans, the claim lands differently. It doesn't feel like a misplaced object. It feels like a misplaced person. In central Texas, along stretches of riverbed and limestone exposed by drought and erosion, footprints have been at the center of arguments for decades. The region is famous for dinosaur tracks, long, three-toed impressions marching across ancient mudflats like signatures. But mixed among those stories are other reports, prints that look vaguely human, as if someone walked barefoot through mud that later turned to stone. There is a reason such claims catch fire. A footprint is intimate. It invites you to imagine the walker, the temperature of the day, the texture of the mud, the brief pause as the heel lifts. It turns geology into a scene. But footprints are also deceptive. Erosion can reshape a track until it resembles something else. A dinosaur print can weather in a way that rounds edges, collapses toes, and leaves an oval that, in the right light, reads as a human step. Cracks can mimic toe lines. Mineral staining can outline forms that aren't truly there. And limestone, which can preserve tracks beautifully, can also fracture and distort them. So when people bring forward images of human tracks in ancient rock, the first responsible task is not to argue, but to examine. Is the morphology consistent? Does it show a clear heel-to-toe gradient? Are there toe impressions where toes should be? Does the stride pattern make sense? Is there evidence of a foot's flexible arch, or is it just an eroded cavity? These are not cynical questions. They are the questions that protect wonder from turning into self-deception. Still, the mystery persists because the experience of seeing such a print, especially in person, can be powerful. Light grazes the stone, and suddenly, for a second, you see it, a human outline in the wrong chapter of the book. The mind catches. The heart speeds up. You feel, briefly, as if time has made a mistake. And in that moment, the story becomes less about science and more about the psychology of belief. Because the past is not only what happened, it is what we can bear to accept happened. We like our timelines because they give us orientation. They tell us that the world is legible. But a footprint in the wrong layer suggests that legibility might be an illusion, like a photograph that looks clear until you zoom in and realize the edges are blurred. So people react in predictable ways. Some latch onto the footprint as proof that everything is wrong and must be replaced by a grander narrative. Others insist it must be a misinterpretation and treat the claimant as foolish or dishonest. Both reactions flatten the complexity of what it means to encounter something ambiguous and emotionally charged. What if the truer lesson is simpler? A footprint teaches us that evidence is not only about objects, it is about context, preservation, and interpretation. A single print without rigorous documentation, exact location, stratigraphic layer, surrounding tracks, sediment analysis, remains a question, not an answer. And the more famous a print becomes, the harder it is to treat it neutrally. It becomes a symbol in a cultural argument, rather than a specimen in a careful study. Yet even in uncertainty, there is something worth keeping. When the river drops and ancient mudflats emerge, we are reminded that the world has memory. The surface we stand on once held living bodies, dinosaur, reptile, bird, and in more recent times, human. We are not separate from that procession. We are part of it, leaving our own impressions everywhere we go, most of them soft and temporary, erased by the next wind, the next rain, the next tide. And that brings us to a more human question. Why do we want to find ourselves in the deep past? Maybe it's vanity. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's the desire to believe we are older than we are, that our story runs deeper into the earth than the textbooks allow. Or maybe it's something gentler, the longing to feel connected to time in a way that doesn't end at our own brief lifespan. In the next chapter, we'll move from footprints to something even more intimate than tracks in mud. Objects that appear to carry craft, pattern, and technological intention, things that look less like nature's mimicry and more like deliberate design. And we'll ask a careful question that doesn't demand an extreme answer. When the past seems to leave behind signs of intelligence, how do we separate what we want to see from what is actually there? There is a certain kind of pattern that makes the human mind stand up straight. Not the loose pattern of clouds or waves, but the kind that feels deliberate, repeating angles, evenly spaced grooves, a symmetry that suggests a plan. When people talk about impossible artifacts, they often return to this feeling. The sensation of looking at something in stone and thinking, someone meant for this to be this way. In workshops and factories, we trust that sensation. We see a thread on a bolt and know it was cut. We see a circle drilled through metal and know it was made. Our lives depend on that recognition. But deep in the geological record, that same recognition can become a trap, because nature, given time and pressure, becomes an artist of repetition. Minerals crystallize into hexagons, cubes, and perfect facets. Layers fold into ripples as regular as printed lines. Rocks fracture along planes that look machined. Concretions form spheres and disks. Iron deposits stain stone in bands that resemble circuitry. And when you combine these processes with erosion, wind and water acting like sculptors, you can get objects that look not only shaped, but engineered. This is the point where skepticism and wonder often talk past each other. The skeptic sees a natural formation that only resembles design and feels frustration at what seems like sloppy reasoning. The believer sees design hidden in plain sight and feels frustration at what seems like an unwillingness to admit a mystery. Both are driven by something human, the desire for a coherent story. But coherence is not the same as truth. The more responsible approach is to treat design-like objects the way a good investigator treats a strange sound at night. Not as proof of an intruder, but as a signal worth checking carefully. What is it made of? How did it form? Does it show tool marks consistent with human manufacturing? Does it have an alloy composition that matches known industrial processes? Does it appear in a context that can be independently verified? Most of the time, the answers pull us back toward ordinary geology. A sphere with grooves may be a concretion with differential weathering. A metal-like sheen may be pyrite or hematite. A bolt shape may be a fossilized stem or a mineral growth. And this doesn't collapse wonder, it reshapes it. It reminds us that the planet is capable of producing structures as elegant as anything we build, given enough time. Still, a few reports refuse to settle so easily, not because they are certainly extraordinary, but because they highlight a quieter tension. We do not have perfect access to the past. Some objects appear briefly, then vanish into private hands or lost storage rooms. Some are described in old newspaper accounts with no surviving specimen. Some are photographed at angles that invite interpretation but don't allow measurement. And when evidence becomes slippery, it doesn't automatically become false. It becomes fragile. It becomes something that can't carry the weight people want it to carry. This fragility is the real heartache of anomalous artifacts. In a perfect world, every unusual find would be carefully documented, analyzed, and archived. But the world isn't perfect, and history, ironically, is full of missing history. Objects are stolen, sold, melted, discarded, forgotten. Families move, museums close, records get boxed and never opened again. So we end up with shadows, images, descriptions, and the haunting sense that something once existed in someone's hands, even if we can't hold it now. And in that gap between what was seen and what can be proven, the imagination thrives. Sometimes it thrives irresponsibly, building grand castles on thin foundations. But sometimes it thrives in a more human way, as a reminder that certainty is not the default state of knowledge. Knowledge is earned, it is tested, it is revised, and it depends on evidence surviving long enough to be questioned properly. There's another aspect to these patent objects, and it's one we rarely name: our discomfort with randomness. We like to believe the world is either orderly by intention or orderly by law. When nature produces something that looks intentional, it disturbs that boundary. It suggests that the universe can create design without a designer, symmetry without planning, order without mind. That idea can be more unsettling than the notion of a hidden civilization. It challenges the specialness we assign to our own creations. So perhaps the question is not only whether certain artifacts are truly out of place. Perhaps the question is what we mean when we say place at all. Place is context. Place is expectation. Place is the story we tell about what belongs where. In the next chapter, we'll follow these anomalies into a setting that feels like the Earth's most dramatic stage, regions shaped by fire, volcanoes, lava flows, and sudden burial. Because when objects are said to be trapped beneath volcanic layers, the timeline becomes sharper, the dating more specific, and the tension between mystery and explanation grows even tighter. If stone is the Earth's memory, then volcanic ash is its punctuation, and punctuation can change the meaning of a sentence completely. Volcanoes write quickly. Most of the Earth's memory is slow, sediment settling grain by grain, pressure building over ages, layers forming with patience we can barely imagine. But a volcano is different. It is the past, recorded in an instant, a village buried in a night, a forest sealed in ash before morning, a landscape remade before the birds return. That speed is why volcanic layers feel so compelling in these stories. If something is trapped beneath lava or ash, the mind assumes the context must be secure. The layer can sometimes be dated. The event can sometimes be tied to a known eruption. It feels like the planet has stamped a date onto the scene. And yet, even here, the Earth refuses to behave like a simple archive. Consider what it means for an object to be beneath a lava flow. Lava moves like thick, glowing syrup, but it is still a moving river. It can roll over objects and leave cavities. It can incorporate surface debris. It can fracture later, allowing water, minerals, and sediments to invade and re-cement. In some environments, a lava flow can create tubes, hollow channels where molten rock once ran, later collapsing and trapping whatever falls into them. Over time, those cavities can fill, harden, and appear as though they were always sealed. Ash behaves differently, but it also has tricks. Fine volcanic ash can blanket a region like snowfall. It can preserve footprints, leaves, and the delicate outlines of things that would normally disappear. It can also be reworked, blown by wind, moved by water, layered again and again. A single eruption can be rearranged into multiple deposits that look older or younger depending on where you stand. So when someone says, "This object was found under volcanic material," the responsible response is not immediate awe or immediate dismissal. It is a set of questions. Was it truly beneath an undisturbed layer, or inside a fissure or tube? Was the deposit intact or reworked? Was the object in primary context or in a pocket formed later? These questions matter because volcanic settings have a special relationship with myth. The drama of fire invites drama in interpretation. If the earth itself erupted, surely it can hide extraordinary things. And sometimes volcanoes do hide extraordinary things, just not the kinds we fantasize about. They hide ordinary lives, a bowl left on a table, a child's toy, a coin in a pocket, tools in a workshop, a door frame, a dog's paw prints, the evidence of humans caught mid-sentence, frozen by catastrophe. The power of these discoveries is not that they rewrite evolution, but that they make the past feel present. They remind us that history is not a set of dates. It is a room someone once stood in, holding a cup, thinking about dinner. The temptation with anomalous volcanic finds is to treat them like proof that the timeline is wrong, rather than proof that the Earth can preserve and rearrange in ways that confuse us. A modern object can end up in an older-looking pocket. An older object can be brought upward by erosion and then reburied by later flows. A cavern can connect layers that seem separate. Fire can seal, but time can reopen. So where does that leave the mystery? It leaves it in the space between precision and humility. Volcanic dating can be powerful, but it is not magic. It dates the rock, not necessarily every object associated with the rock. A lava flow can be dated, but an object found in a fracture within that flow may have entered long after the rock cooled. An ash layer can be dated, but an artifact sitting in reworked ash might not be the age you think it is. The Earth can present a convincing stage set, ancient scenery with modern props, if you don't examine the seams. And yet, even after acknowledging all this, the emotional weight remains, because the idea of an object sealed by fire touches something primal. The sense that time can lock a moment away and then, centuries later, hand it back. That is the human longing behind these stories. Not just to be surprised, but to touch a past that feels unreachable. In the next chapter, we'll shift from objects and impressions to something more fragile, documentation itself. Because many of these claims survive not as physical artifacts, but as reports, letters, old newspaper clippings, museum notes, second-hand accounts. And when evidence lives mostly in memory and paper, the question becomes even more intimate. How do we tell the difference between history and the stories history leaves behind? After all, the Earth isn't the only thing that stratifies. So do our narratives, layered by retelling, compressed by time, and sometimes under pressure, transformed into something that looks like stone. Most mysteries don't survive as objects. They survive as sentences. A paragraph in a local newspaper, a note in a museum ledger, a letter written by someone who sounded sincere, describing something they held for a moment and then lost. A photograph copied until the edges blur. A story told at a dinner table, then retold in a book, then repeated online until it becomes less an event and more a myth with a familiar outline. This is the invisible layer in every out-of-place account, the layer of documentation. If you could line up the world's anomalous claims, Like artifacts on a shelf, you'd notice something quickly. The strongest cases are not always the most famous. Fame often belongs to the stories that are easiest to tell, not the ones easiest to verify. A bell in coal, a hammer in rock, a footprint in stone. These images are vivid, simple, and emotionally charged. They travel well, but verification is harder. Verification requires chains of custody. It requires dates, locations, materials, witnesses who can be interviewed, objects that can be re-examined. And in many of these cases, the chain is broken early, sometimes within hours of discovery. Someone finds something strange and keeps it. Someone else hears about it and writes a short piece. The object is passed around, admired, maybe photographed, maybe not. Then time does what it always does. It scatters people and erodes certainty. The object disappears into an attic, a pawn shop, a private collection. The paper record survives like a fossil, not the thing itself, but the impression of it. And that impression becomes the battlefield. Skeptics point out correctly that a story without evidence cannot carry extraordinary conclusions. Believers point out, sometimes correctly, that evidence can be lost without the event being false. Both are true, and neither resolves the ache of not knowing. This is why the most honest approach to these accounts is to treat them as a spectrum. On one end are well-documented finds, objects with clear provenance, multiple independent examinations, photographs, tests, and preserved context. These can be debated with substance. On the other end are pure anecdotes, captivating stories with no surviving specimen and no reliable trail. These can be appreciated as cultural artifacts, stories about the human relationship with time, without pretending they are scientific proof. Most impossible artifacts sit somewhere in the middle, and that middle is uncomfortable. It forces us to hold uncertainty without turning it into certainty. There's a reason uncertainty feels like hunger. The mind wants closure. It wants a conclusion. But the past does not owe us closure. The past is under no obligation to arrange itself into a satisfying narrative arc. And yet, for a documentary storyteller, there is value in this discomfort. Because the real subject here might not be whether the timeline is wrong. The real subject might be the tension between evidence and meaning. A coin found in a strange place may not rewrite history, but it can illuminate forgotten roots and human drift. A hammer in rock may not be ancient, but it can teach us how quickly nature can mimic deep time. A footprint may be misread, but it can reveal our longing to place ourselves inside the planet's oldest chapters. Even a mistaken anomaly can be a true mirror. It can show us what we fear. It can show us what we want. It can show us how quickly communities form around a story and how quickly institutions close ranks against embarrassment. It can show us the ways curiosity can become either careful investigation or careless certainty. And this is where ethics matters, because there is a subtle cruelty in exploiting mysteries for thrill. Sensational stories can make people feel alive for a moment, but they often leave behind cynicism. They teach audiences to distrust everything, to believe only in hidden plots or absolute debunking, to treat knowledge as a game of humiliation. That is not the tone we want here. Here, we want something more human. The courage to say, "I don't know," without losing the desire to look. So when we encounter these claims, we can ask two kinds of questions at once. The first kind is scientific. What is the best explanation consistent with geology, archaeology, and physics? What tests could clarify the issue? What evidence would be required? to shift the mainstream view. The second kind is human. What does this story reveal about the people who told it? What was their world like? What did they risk by speaking? What did they gain? What did they lose? Because every anomaly is also a human event. Someone noticed. Someone cared. Someone chose to keep or discard. Someone chose to publish or remain silent. Someone chose to believe or doubt. And often, the most powerful layer in the story is that choice. In the next chapter, we'll return to the objects themselves, but with a new lens. We'll look at the ways impossible artifacts are used as symbols in arguments about evolution and progress, and we'll ask a calmer question: what happens when we confuse the limits of our knowledge with the collapse of knowledge itself? Sometimes the timeline isn't reversed. Sometimes it's just incomplete, like a book with missing pages. It's easy to think the argument is about evolution, but most of the time, it's about something more personal: how people feel inside a story. The standard timeline of life on Earth is not merely a scientific model. For many, it functions like a worldview, an orientation system. It tells us that the world is old, that life changed gradually, that humans arrived late, that intelligence is a recent bloom on a long tree. It's a story that can feel both humbling and stabilizing. So when someone presents an out-of-place artifact, especially one framed as being impossibly ancient, it doesn't just challenge a data point. It challenges a sense of belonging. It provokes a defensive response, not always because the evidence is strong, but because the story is sacred, in the quiet way everyday assumptions can be sacred. On the other side, those who collect and share these anomalies are not always motivated by hostility to science. Often, they are motivated by wonder, and sometimes by bruising. They remember being told to stop asking questions. They remember being laughed at for noticing something odd. They remember a teacher, a parent, an expert whose certainty felt like a door slammed shut. In that emotional landscape, an impossible artifact becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a symbol of rebellion against dismissal. It becomes proof that the world still has room for surprise. So the artifacts take on a second life. They stop being objects and become arguments. A bell in coal becomes a weapon against textbooks. A hammer in rock becomes a banner for alternative histories. A footprint becomes a declaration that humans are older than the mainstream admits. And once an object becomes a symbol, it becomes harder to investigate honestly. The goal shifts from understanding to winning. That shift is where the real danger lives. Because science is not a fortress, it's a method. It doesn't claim to be finished. It claims to be self-correcting. But self-correction requires good evidence, careful testing, and the humility to say, "not yet," without turning "not yet" into never. Likewise, curiosity is not an enemy of rigor. But curiosity becomes destructive when it refuses to accept standards of proof. When it treats every unresolved question as confirmation of a desired conclusion, it stops being curiosity and becomes certainty wearing a costume. So what does a responsible middle path look like? It looks like refusing to treat anomalies as automatic proof of a reversed timeline, while also refusing to treat anomalies as automatic nonsense. It looks like asking, what is this object really? How did it form? What is the most likely explanation? What would it take to rule out that explanation? What additional data would shift the probability? It also looks like acknowledging something uncomfortable. Even if every famous impossible artifact turned out to have an ordinary explanation, the story of human evolution and human history would still contain vast unknowns. The mainstream timeline is strong because it is supported by multiple independent lines of evidence: fossils, genetics, stratigraphy, radiometric dating, comparative anatomy, and more. But strength is not the same as completeness. There are missing hominin fossils. There are gaps in migration routes. There are lost languages, lost tools, lost communities erased by rising seas and shifting deserts. Entire coastlines that once held human life are now underwater, their traces swallowed. In other words, the official story is not a lie. It is a map with blank areas. And blank areas are where myths grow. Not because people are foolish, but because humans cannot stand blankness for long. We fill it with possibilities, some plausible, some not. If you listen carefully, many anomaly stories are not really saying evolution is wrong. They are saying the world feels bigger than the story I was given. That impulse deserves empathy. The world is bigger. Reality does not shrink to fit our narratives. So perhaps the purpose of this journey is not to pick a side, but to refine a skill, the skill of living with mystery without surrendering to fantasy or cynicism. Mystery can be an engine. It can push investigation forward. It can keep the mind open. But mystery can also become an addiction, a constant hunger for the next shock, the next secret. And when it becomes that, it turns the past into entertainment rather than a place where real lives once unfolded. In the next chapter, we'll step back from the debate and move towards something quieter. The people behind these stories. The miners, the hikers, the divers, the amateur collectors, the small-town historians, the curious students. Because the most enduring layer in all of this is not stone or metal. It is human attention. The moment someone looked at an ordinary piece of the world and felt honestly that it might contain a deeper time than anyone expected. You can measure the age of a rock, but you can't measure the moment a person decided to look closer. That moment, attention, is where all these stories truly begin. Before any argument about dating or geology, there is a human being standing in a place, holding something, feeling the quiet shock of the unexpected. And if we slow down enough to see that person clearly, the mystery becomes less about proving a grand alternative history and more about understanding what it means to live on a planet that keeps surprising us. Picture the miner again, not as a character in a controversy, but as a worker with a family and tired hands. He comes home with dust in his hair, sits at the kitchen table, and shows his spouse or child something he found. For a moment, the house becomes a small museum. A neighbor leans in. Someone laughs. Someone gets uneasy. Someone says, "That can't be real." Someone else says, "But it's right here." The artifact becomes a shared experience, a tiny crack in the daily routine. Or picture the hiker who breaks open a rock and sees a familiar tool sealed inside. What happens next is not a scientific paper. It's a phone call, a conversation, maybe a visit to a local expert, maybe a trip to a library, maybe nothing at all. Just the story carried in memory like a stone in a pocket. In a perfect world, every unusual discovery would be documented with professional precision. But most discoveries happen far from perfect circumstances. They happen in basements and fields, in remote dig sites and roadside cuts. The people who find them are not trained archivists. They are ordinary humans encountering something that feels extraordinary. And ordinary humans have ordinary limits: time, money, fear of ridicule, fear of trouble, uncertainty about who to trust. This matters because it explains why so many anomaly stories are incomplete. It's not always malice or fraud. Sometimes it's life. Sometimes it's the simple fact that curiosity is fragile, easily crushed by embarrassment or exhaustion. Sometimes it's the sense that institutions will not listen unless you already speak their language. So the artifacts drift into the informal world, private collections, small curiosity museums, local legends. And in that world, meaning grows faster than verification. The object becomes a family relic. The story becomes a tradition. The details sharpen in some places and blur in others. This is how folklore forms, not necessarily from lies, but from the way memory shapes itself around feeling. And what feeling is at the core here? Often, it's awe mixed with disorientation. Awe is the recognition that reality is bigger than your understanding. Disorientation is the realization that the categories you rely on might be less solid than you assumed. Together, they produce a kind of quiet tremor, a sense that the world is both stable and strange at the same time. For many people, that tremor is the closest thing to spiritual experience they allow themselves. Not religious in a dogmatic sense, but reverent, a humility before time. And here, something important becomes clear. You don't need the artifacts to be impossibly ancient for the human experience to be real. Even if the bell came from a coal bin rather than inside coal, the boy's wonder was real. Even if the hammer was encased by recent mineralization, the shock of seeing it inside stone was real. Even if a human footprint was an eroded dinosaur track, the feeling of seeing a human shape in deep time was real. The danger is when we confuse the reality of the feeling with the certainty of the conclusion. A feeling can be a doorway, but it is not a verdict. The more mature response is to let the feeling lead to better questions rather than louder claims, to let wonder become disciplined, to let uncertainty become careful investigation rather than rigid belief. Because there is another truth lurking beneath these stories. Science itself began as wonder. The first astronomers were not sure of anything. They stared at the sky because it was beautiful and confusing. The first geologists were not certain of ages. They were struck by the strangeness of cliffs and fossils. Curiosity is the seed. Rigor is what helps it survive. So perhaps the story we are really telling is not the timeline is wrong or the anomalies are nonsense. Perhaps the story is that the human mind is built to seek meaning in the layers, and that meaning can lead us toward truth if we remain honest about what we know and what we don't. In the next chapter, we'll gather the threads, not to declare a final answer, but to ask a final kind of question. What does it mean to live in a world where the past is both knowable and unknowable, where evidence can be strong and still incomplete, where memory, human and geological, can both reveal and distort? Because in the end, these stories are not only about artifacts, they are about how we choose to relate to time itself. If you listen to these stories long enough, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with bells or hammers. The pattern is the human relationship with certainty. We want the past to behave like a straight road with mile markers. We want it to be navigable. We want to be able to say, with confidence, this happened before that, and this belongs here, not there. And for the most part, that desire is met. The methods we've built, stratigraphy, radiometric dating, genetics, comparative anatomy, give us a remarkably coherent picture of life's deep history and humanity's recent ascent. But coherence can become a comfort we cling to, and comfort can become a kind of blindness. When an anomaly appears, an object in the wrong context, a pattern that looks engineered, an impression that resembles a human step, It tests more than a hypothesis. It tests our tolerance for uncertainty. It asks whether we can hold two truths at once, that the mainstream timeline is strongly supported, and that the world still contains unsolved puzzles and messy edge cases. In other words, it asks whether we can live with an unfinished story, because that is the reality of knowledge. Knowledge is not a monument. It is a living thing, built, corrected, refined, sometimes humbled. The most honest historians and scientists will tell you that every answer opens more questions. Every discovery reveals a larger horizon of ignorance. So why do these anomaly stories persist, even when many can be explained by natural processes, misinterpretations, or lost documentation? They persist because they keep that horizon visible. They remind us that the past is not a neatly labeled shelf. It is a landscape with fog. Some parts are lit by strong evidence. Other parts are dim. And in the dim parts, imagination walks ahead of proof, sometimes gently, sometimes recklessly. A mature culture needs both light and humility. It needs the discipline to demand evidence. And it needs the courage to admit what has not yet been found. This is where the phrase reverse evolution timeline becomes less literal and more metaphorical, because the deepest reversal in these stories is not biological, it's psychological. It's the reversal of our assumption that certainty is the default and mystery is an error. Perhaps it's the other way around. Mystery is the default, and certainty is something we carve out carefully from a world that doesn't owe us clarity. The Earth is ancient beyond our intuition. Human history is short, and yet full of gaps. Civilizations rise and fall, leaving fragments. Coastlines shift, drowning settlements. Deserts advance and bury roads. Forests reclaim villages. The archive of the world is constantly being edited by water, wind, and time. And our own archive, memory, is even more vulnerable. We misremember, we simplify, we sharpen what matters to us and lose what doesn't. We turn complex events into clean narratives because clean narratives are easier to carry. So perhaps the most valuable lesson in these anomaly tales is not what they claim, but what they reveal about how we build belief. Some people hear these stories and conclude that everything official is a lie. That is a kind of despair disguised as confidence. Other people hear these stories and conclude that anyone who shares them is foolish. That is a kind of fear disguised as sophistication. The wiser response is slower. It says, show me the object, show me the context, show me the measurements. And if you can't, tell me the story honestly as a story, valuable for what it reveals about human curiosity, not as a weapon against reality. It also says, keep looking, not for proof of a preferred conclusion, but for clearer data. Encourage documentation, preserve specimens, invite experts to examine them without ridicule, invite amateurs to share without shame. Build bridges between curiosity and rigor. Because the truth is, there are still discoveries waiting that will reshape details of our understanding. New fossils will fill gaps. New genetic evidence will refine migration paths. Underwater archaeology will reveal coastal histories we've barely touched. Even the deep past, life's earliest chapters, continues to surprise us with new forms and new timelines. The story of knowledge is not finished, and that is not a threat. It is a promise. As we approach the end of this journey, let one thought settle in. The past is not a static place. It is an active relationship between evidence, interpretation, and humility. The question is not whether we can eliminate mystery. The question is whether we can learn to live with it, without turning it into superstition, and without suffocating it with contempt. Because mystery, held responsibly, is not the enemy of truth, it is the doorway to it. In the end, the earth does not speak in sentences. It speaks in layers. And layers are not like pages in a book. They can tear, they can fold, they can be carried away and redeposited somewhere else. They can be punctured by roots and rivers. They can be cracked by ice, invaded by minerals, sealed by fire. A layer can preserve a moment with astonishing fidelity or erase it completely. This is why the idea of impossible artifacts is so enduring. It takes our neat mental timeline and presses it against the messy reality of the world. It asks us to notice the difference between how we want history to work and how history actually survives. Along this journey, we've met objects that feel like questions in human form. A bell that seemed to fall from coal. A hammer that appeared inside stone. Coin-like finds in unlikely places. Spheres and patterns that resemble design. Footprints that look like a person walking through an ancient world. And stories that survive mostly as paper trails and memory. We have not treated these as proofs of secret empires or reversed evolution. We have treated them as the kinds of mysteries that are more useful than sensational. Mysteries that teach us how to think. Because what matters most here is not whether any one artifact is authentically ancient beyond possibility. What matters is what happens inside us when we encounter the unexpected. Some part of us wants the anomaly to be true because it would make the world feel larger, wilder, less settled. Another part of us wants the anomaly to be false because it would protect the stability of the story that helps us navigate life. Both impulses are human. Both can become dangerous if they harden into reflex. The humanistic path is to stay soft, to feel wonder without surrendering judgment, to demand evidence without mocking curiosity, to accept that even the strongest story of the past is a model, powerful, tested, deeply informative, and still, by definition, incomplete. And here is the quiet insight that sits beneath all of it. The past is not only a record of what happened, it is a record of what survived. What survived the weather? What survived the shifting of continents? What survived the accidents of discovery? What survived the decisions of collectors and curators? What survived the simple fact that human attention is finite and fragile? If you think about that long enough, it changes the emotional color of history. It stops being a perfect museum and becomes something more like a shoreline, beautiful, dynamic, littered with fragments shaped by forces beyond our control. In that view, anomalies are not necessarily signs that everything is wrong. They are reminders that the archive is partial. They are reminders that the Earth is capable of preserving surprising things and also capable of rearranging them in ways that confuse us. They are reminders that our certainty is always provisional, and that humility is not weakness, but realism. And perhaps, most of all, they are reminders that we are not separate from the story we study. We are living layers too. Every day, we leave traces, some physical, some emotional, some cultural. Most will disappear. A few will remain. And whoever finds them in some distant future will interpret them through their own expectations, their own categories, their own hunger for meaning. They will see patterns. They will debate context. They will argue about what belongs where. Maybe they will find something of ours in the wrong place and feel the same quiet tremor of disorientation. Maybe they will invent stories about us that are partly true and partly shaped by their own needs. Maybe they will do what we do now, stand at the edge of the unknown and try to make a home there. So we end where we began, with a question, not a conclusion. What if the ground beneath our feet is not a calendar, but a diary, one written in a language of pressure, water, fire, and time? What if memory, whether human or geological, is less like a photograph and more like a landscape, beautiful, incomplete, and always changing? If that is true, then the task is not to demand that the past be perfectly orderly. The task is to listen carefully, to investigate honestly, and to remain human in the face of what we cannot fully know. Because the future will judge us not only by what we believed, but by how we held our questions. And perhaps the most timeless question of all is this: when truth is layered, fragile, and sometimes hidden, what kind of curiosity will we choose to live by?